All right, recap from yesterday. All the animals and Red are trying to get a plan to help Samar's wish come true. So they are all working together to help her and the neighbor boy become friends, Stephen. So now, starting on this chapter, we are on plan number 3. Once night had fallen, I sent Bongo on her next mission. All you have to do is untie Samar's wish, I instructed. Oh, she said, is that all? Bongo flew to the low branch where Samar had tied her pink dotted fabric scrap. She yanked on it with her beak several times. Easier said than done, she reported. You're a crow, use a tool. Crows are well known for making and using tools. They're probably the brainiest birds around. Bongo poked and considered. I have a paperclip in my collection, I'll give that a shot. It'll never work, Agnes predicted from her nest. I think owls are secretly a bit jealous of crows. One by one, heads poked out of my hollows as well as the skunk den under the porch to watch Bongo at work. What's Bongo doing, Ma? Asked one of the ewes. It's called tool use, said Big Ewe. No big deal. Folks, if you can't say something helpful, I said, please don't say anything at all. Bongo returned with a small piece of twisted metal. Straightened paperclip, she explained. Found it on the school playground. With great effort, she managed to slide the stray end of the paperclip into the knot. But try as she might, she couldn't pull the knot free. Almost got it, Bongo muttered between her clenched beak. Why is Bongo doing that? Harold asked Agnes. There's no explaining crows, Agnes said. Because I asked her to, I said. Because it's important to me. With a frustrated groan, Bongo let the paperclip fall to the ground. It's no use, Red, she said. Maybe it's time to give up on this idea, I said with a sigh. I'm not meant to help. I meant to sit here. Just sit. A gentle wind rippled my leaves. No one spoke. Wait just a minute, said Big Ewe. Maybe I can lend you a paw. You're awfully heavy for that branch, Agnes pointed out. Let her try, I said. Carefully, Big Ewe inched her way out onto the limb where Samar's wish was tied. She was indeed heavy, and my branch bowed under her weight, but I held firm. She toyed with the knot, using both front paws. Before long, she'd pulled the strip free. Ta-da! She cried, clutching the fabric in her right paw. Well, I did the hard part, Bongo sulked. It was a joint effort, I said. Teamwork, and much appreciated, both of you. You have the wish, said Agnes. Now what, Red? Now we wait until Samar comes to visit, I said, and then Bongo works her magic. The moon bathed us all in cool blue light as we awaited Samar's nightly visit. She came out in her robe and slippers. Sitting on her blanket, she waited patiently as the baby scrambled over to see her. Around her neck, she was wearing the beribboned key that Bongo had given her. Where's my crow friend? She whispered as the ewes somersaulted in front of her. She looked up into the branches, and I was glad I'd instructed Bongo to hide on Stephen's roof. Right on schedule, Bongo flew to Stephen's bedroom window. She settled on the sill. Samar's fabric scrap dangled in her beak. Carefully, she tapped on Stephen's window. Nothing happened. I told Bongo to be as quiet as possible. We didn't want Samar to see what we were up to. Tap, 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 louder this time. Still nothing. Stephen, apparently, was quite a sound sleeper. Bongo looked at me. Her eyes said, now what? She tried again. Tap, tap, tap. Samar started. What was that? She asked. Fortunately, Harold distracted her with an attempt to fly onto her arm. It was more awkward hop than flight, and Samar giggled. Good going, little Harold, I thought. Bongo dropped Samar's wish onto the sill. Tap, tap, tap. Nothing. She paced back and forth in front of the window. Then she froze. Her eyes glinted in the moonlight. Bongo leaned closer to the glass and performed her very best fire engine siren. By the time Stephen's window flew open, Bongo was already back on the roof, watching her efforts pay off. Stephen peered out. He rubbed his eyes. He noticed the scrap on his sill. Frowning, he held it up, catching the moonlight in order to read the words written on the fabric. He looked down at the lawn. There was Samar, looking up at him, surrounded by an odd collection of baby animals. You rock, said Bongo. When Stephen eased out the front door, he was wearing red pajamas and a gray sweatshirt. His light brown hair was mussed, his eyes blurry. The flashlight he was carrying sliced through the darkness. The babies turned toward him and froze. Their eyes glowed like little moons. Flash squealed in fear. Stephen clicked off his light, and Flash seemed to calm a bit, although he was definitely hiccuping. Hey, Stephen whispered back. Hi, Samar whispered back. Stephen sat down next to Samar. The babies watched with interest. Why did they come to you? Stephen asked. I don't know. It's like magic. No, Samar shook her head. I'm just quiet. They like that. Bongo flew down to Samar's shoulder. "Hello," she said to Stephen, mimicking Samar's voice. "Wow," he said, "that's amazing. Yesterday I heard her imitate a doorbell." Stephen grinned. "She gave me this key," Samar said, holding it up. "I don't know what it's for. A diary or a jewelry box, maybe? Or the world's smallest door," Stephen joked. For a while, everyone fell silent. Even the baby raccoons were still. At last, Stephen held out his hand, revealing Samar's wish. "I found this," he said. Even in the moonlight, Samar's blush was visible. She looked away. "I'm sorry about that word," Stephen said softly. "The word on the tree. It wasn't us." Samar nodded. "My parents aren't bad people. They're just afraid of things," Stephen shrugged. "So are mine," said Samar. "I heard my father talking about moving. If we can find a safe place to go." She gave a sad smile. "If there even is such a place." "I'm sorry," Stephen said again. The babies, sensing Stephen could be trusted, began to tussle and romp. Harold and the smallest youth searched for bugs. Rose Petal and her brother, Hot Buttered Popcorn, played tug-of-war with a long piece of grass. "I'll miss them," Samar said. "I hope you don't move," Stephen said. A light blinked on in Stephen's house. "I should go," he said. "If my parents see me, I should go." "Night," Samar said in a whisper. Oh, the things I wanted to say to those two. I wanted to tell them that friendship doesn't have to be hard, that sometimes we let the world make it hard. I wanted to tell them to keep talking. I wanted to make a difference, just a difference, before I left this lovely world. And so I did it. I broke the rule. "Stay," I said. The animals gaped at me in astonishment. Even the youngest babies knew about the "don't talk to people" rule. Bongo darted to my top branch. "Red," she cried in a strangled whisper. "You can't." "Oh, but I can," I said. "What have I got to lose?" "But," as I was saying, I returned my attention to Stephen and Samar. They were staring at me, jaws dropped, eyes wide, as frozen as Flash had been not long ago. "We're dreaming," Stephen murmured. "Right at the same time," Samar asked. "Is that possible?" "Pinch me," Stephen said. Samar complied. "Definitely felt that," Stephen reported. "Maybe it was a dream pinch," Samar suggested. "Excuse me," I interrupted. "I have 216 rings worth of wisdom to convey, and not much time." Stephen reached for Samar's hand. "If it's a dream," he said, "at least it's a cool one." And so I began. I haven't always been a wish tree. It happened in 1848, long before I was surrounded by concrete and cars, when I was just a few decades old, still a youngster by Red Oak standards. No longer a lanky slapling, I was solid and strong, but not anchored to the earth the way I am now. This was a time like many other times when hungry, desperate people sailed on crowded boats to settle here. Many of them ended up, as they always seem to, in my neighborhood. The blue and green houses were brown then and filled to overflowing with new arrivals. Sometimes the newcomers were welcomed, sometimes they were not, but still they came, hoping and wishing, as people always do. One of our new residents was a young Irish girl named Maeve. She'd voyaged across the Atlantic with her 19-year-old brother, who died of dysentery during the trip. Their mother had passed away shortly after Maeve was born, their father when the children were 9 and 12. Maeve was solid and plain, but when she smiled, it was like sunshine peeking through clouds. She had a deep laugh, and her hair was as brilliantly red as my finest autumn attire. 16, alone and penniless, Maeve shared a tiny room with 5 other immigrants. She worked night and day, cleaning and cooking and doing whatever she could to stay alive. Maeve soon discovered she was gifted at caring for the sick. She had no special knowledge, no secret remedies, but she was kind and patient, and she knew how to soothe a fevered brow with a cool cloth as well as anyone. What she didn't know, she was willing to learn. As time passed, word grew of Maeve's abilities. People brought her their sick piglets and their lame horses, their coughing children and fretful babies. Always she explained that she wasn't sure she could help, but since people in the neighborhood were too poor to go to a doctor, they turned to Maeve. And since people believed she could help them get better, Maeve tried to live up to their hopes. When she succeeded, and even when she didn't, patients and their families would leave small tokens for her: a whittled figurine of a bird, a hairpin, half a loaf of bread. Once someone even left a leather-covered journal with a tiny silver key that opened its lock. When Maeve was out tending to someone who was sick, people took to leaving their thank yous in my lowest hollow. It was still a fresh wound, just a couple of seasons mended, but because it faced the house where Maeve roomed and not the street, it was a safe place to leave a token of gratitude. That's when I realized that hollows can be a good thing for people, not just birds and animals. Little did I know just how good. The years passed and Maeve became as connected to the neighborhood as I was, even as newcomers from other lands added their music and food and language to our little part of the world. No matter where people were from, Maeve cared for them as best she could. I grew tougher, my older limbs less pliable, my shadow longer. More trees and shrubs joined me, but there was plenty of sun for all of us, and we never wanted for water. I'd hosted many families by then, mice and chipmunks in particular. My closest confidant was a young gray squirrel named Squibbles. All squirrel names begin with the letters S-Q-U. Squibbles was especially fond of Maeve, who often fed the little squirrel table scraps. Privately, Squibbles and I worried about Maeve. Along the way, Maeve had seen a suitor or two, but nothing much came of those flirtations. She had friends aplenty and work to do from dawn till dusk. Still, she seemed lonely. Sometimes Maeve would sit on the front steps, watching happy families stroll past, and her eyes would well up with tears. At night, she'd gaze out an open upstairs window, and her sighs would float to us on the breeze, melancholy as the call of a mourning dove. Often, Maeve would sit at the base of my trunk and write in her journal. Now and then, she'd read passages aloud. She spoke about the Irish countryside fading into fog. She spoke about her family she'd lost. She spoke about her secret hopes and fears and longings. She had love to give and no one to give it to. Maeve adored early mornings when the world was bathed in mist and the sun was still a promise. She would lean against my trunk and close her eyes and hum a tune from her childhood. One day, the first day of May, Maeve joined me at dawn. To my surprise, she reached up to my lowest bough and gently tied a scrap of blue striped fabric in a careful knot. "I wish," she whispered, "for someone to love with all my heart." That was my first wish, and the beginning of many more. As the weeks passed, the piece of fabric on my branch drew many comments. Some of the folks in our neighborhood, the ones from Ireland, would nod knowingly and smile. To them, Maeve would simply say, in her lilting voice, "That's my raggy tree. She's not a hawthorn, but she'll do just fine." People who'd come here from other lands, and there were many of them, would frown at the rag or even reach up to remove it. Maeve would warn, "Don't you be touching my wish now." Patiently, again and again, she would explain how in her old home, leaving wishes on a raggy tree was a time-honored tradition. Now and then, people would ask Maeve what she'd wished for. She'd tell them the truth with a sigh and a wry smile. "Nothing much, just someone to love with all my heart. Nothing much at all." Sometimes people would laugh. Sometimes they would roll their eyes. "A wish on a rag won't bring you love, dearie," they would say. But usually people gave Maeve a kind smile, a squeeze on the arm, a knowing nod. And then they, too, would ask if they could add a wish of their own. Another year passed. As May neared, I found myself hosting more scraps of fabric than budding leaves. Squibbles tried to steal a few fabric strips to line his dray, the nest made of leaves and twigs high in one of my forked branches. I explained he'd have to stick with moss and pine needles until the 1st of May. Wishes, according to Maeve, could not be touched until after May Day. Then the ones that weren't carried off in the wind or dragged to the ground by the rain could be removed by people or by enterprising squirrels. I suspect she made up that rule for my benefit, so I could grow unfettered, without the weight of wet rags dragging me down. Just before dawn on the 1st of May, a young woman approached me. She had dark, wavy hair and wore a tattered gray coat. In her arms was a wrapped bundle. "Psst," Squibbles whispered to me. "Here comes another wish, Red." But Squibbles was wrong. There was no wish. Swiftly, but with great care, the girl placed her bundle in my hollow. A thank you for Maeve, I realized. A loaf of bread, perhaps. The girl had probably seen one of her patients. She was gone as quickly as she'd come. Like a hummingbird, I thought. There, then not there. Like a gust of wind. Just a few minutes later, Maeve opened the door of the little brown house. She smiled at me and at the scraps waving in the early morning breeze. And then came the cry. Wail was more like it, coming from me. Not the meek peep of a wren chick. Not the shy squeak of a mouse pup. No, this was a cry of righteous indignation. This was a baby. The baby had a note attached to her blanket. Haltingly, Maeve tried to read it out loud. "Italian," she murmured. Only later, when she consulted one of her patients, did she understand its meaning. "Please give her the care I cannot. I wish for you both a life of love." The baby's hair was black. Maeve's was red. The baby's eyes were brown. Maeve's were blue. The baby was Italian. Maeve was Irish. They were made for each other. Maeve named the baby Amadora, which meant in Italian, the gift of love. Many in the neighborhood didn't approve of an unmarried Irish woman raising an abandoned Italian baby. People talked as they will, and they tisk-tisked as they must. Some people were even angry. They said hurtful things. They told Maeve that Amadora didn't belong. They told Maeve she and the baby should leave. Maeve merely smiled, held Amadora close, and waited and hoped. On dark nights when hope was scarce, she would sing an old Irish tune mixed with a newer Italian song that she had learned from a neighbor. The melody was sweet, the words were silly, the effect was always the same, a smile from little Alma. Sure enough, the longer Maeve waited, the kinder people grew, and before long, Amma, as she came to be called, was as much a part of our messy garden as all the rest of us. When Amma was old enough to feed Squibbles and his family, she did. When she was strong enough to climb me, she did. And when she was ready to make wishes of her own, she did. Amma grew up steady and honest and kind like her mother and had babies of her own, and then grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Eventually, Amma and her husband bought the little brown house and the one right next to it and painted them blue and green. Years later, they purchased a house across the street and began to rent the blue and green houses to other families. The family grew and prospered and argued and failed and loved and laughed. Always and forever, the laughter kept them going. And when Amma's grandson had a little girl, he chose a fine Italian name for her with a fine Irish middle name, Francesca Maeve. As for me, my reputation grew. Hadn't Maeve's wish come true in the heart of a wish tree? Didn't that mean anything was possible? Of course, as Squibbles often reminded me, I'd had nothing to do with it. This isn't a fairy tale, Red, he would say, but people are full of longings, and decade after decade, the hopes kept coming. A blessing and a burden it has been, all those wishes, all those years, but everyone needs hope. At long last, I stopped talking. Once the words had spilled out, it was like trying to stop the wind. In the silence that followed, I felt as if the whole world was holding its breath. I'd broken the rule. Stephen and Samar still stared open-mouthed at me. They looked as rooted to the ground as I was. Neither had uttered a sound while I told my story. The front door to Stephen's house opened. "Stephen," called his father. "What the heck are you doing, young man?" Stephen leapt to his feet. Here I come, Dad." Night, Samar." "Night, Stephen," she said. Stephen dashed toward the porch, but stopped halfway. He spun around to look at me. "Thanks," he said in a quizzical voice, using the same tone he might have used if Bongo had just made him pancakes. The door slammed behind him. Samar stood, holding her blanket to her chest. "I know I must be dreaming," she said. She headed to her own porch and eased open the door. "I just wish," she added with a smile, "that I didn't have to wake up." Almost instantly, I'd regretted what I'd done. I'd broken the rule, the biggie. I'd deliberately spoken to people. And not just a few words, I'd spoken a river of words. I wasn't like that frog in the mailbox. I hadn't broken the rule accidentally. I'd broken the rule because I wanted something. I wanted to matter. I wanted to do something meaningful before I died. I'd done it for myself. After the shocked babies and their equally shocked parents were safely ensconced in their dens, I admitted my feelings to Bongo. I waited for her to yell at me. Bongo is good at yelling. Extremely good. You might even say she has a gift. "Why did I do it, Bongo?" I murmured. "Why?" She flew to home plate. She stroked my rough bark with her sleek head. "You did it, my wise old tree, because you had a story to tell." "It was foolish," I said. "I'm not supposed to be foolish." "Not so foolish," Bongo said, "just hopeful, and everyone needs to hope, Red, even wise old trees." Morning emerged slowly, heavy with clouds. A light rain had fallen just before dawn, soothing my leaves, if not my mood. Oddly, the ground felt saturated. Spring was always muddy, of course, but this was unusual. It would make for a messy wishing day tomorrow. An early rising old gentleman with a bamboo cane approached. He paused to attach a small piece of blue paper to my lowest branch, using a bit of twine. He didn't say his wish aloud, so I couldn't tell what it was, but he had a satisfied smile as he stepped carefully through the soggy grass. No doubt I'd be seeing more wishes today. Many people came early to grab an easy-to-reach spot. This would probably be my last wishing day. How could it be that my first one, that long-ago day with Maeve, still seemed as fresh in my heart as my conversation with Stephen and Samar from the previous night? A car slowed to a crawl near the curb. I saw an arm, a blur, and then, splat, something hit my trunk. Splat, splat, 2 more times, and the car roared off with a screech of tires. Bongo was the first to report on the damage. "Raw eggs," she said. "I'm assuming that didn't hurt?" "Didn't feel a thing," I said. Fresh baked bread, hairy spiders, and Big U ventured out to inspect the situation. Big U slipped under the police tape and licked one of the yolks sliding down my trunk. She murmured. "Raw, just the way I like 'em." "Hey, Big, share the wealth," Harry Spider snapped as she and Fresh joined her. Agnes watched from her perch. "I'd much prefer a squirming mouse pup," she said. "It's all yours, ladies." "What a nice surprise," Big U said between slurps. "This is not nice," Bongo said. "This is people at their worst." "Still," said Harry Spiders, licking her paws, "it'd be a shame to let perfectly good egg go to waste. One creature's nastiness is another creature's nibble." Big U gave a satisfied burp, and the animals scampered back to their homes. The door to Stephen's house opened. He walked over to me, saw the eggshells scattered like puzzle pieces, and scowled. Samar was next, a backpack slung over her shoulder and books clutched to her chest. She leapt over a muddy puddle and joined Stephen. "Jerks," he muttered, gesturing toward the egg remains. "Sorry, Samar." But Samar held up her hand. "Stephen," she said in a low voice, "last night." Stephen nodded ever so slightly. His eyes locked on me. "Last night," he repeated, as if they were speaking in code. "The tree. The tree." You heard what I heard? Samar asked. I did. Samar looked right at Stephen. You heard the tree? I heard the tree. Samar gave a little nod. So it was maybe a trick? Somebody playing a joke on us? Or maybe we were both sleepwalking at the same moment, Stephen suggested. He nodded as if trying to convince himself. Yeah, sleepwalking. Have you ever sleepwalked before? No, but there's a first time for everything. They stood there looking at me expectantly, willing me to speak. At least that's how it felt. I stayed silent. I'd said my piece, and I regretted it. Stephen, Samar said softly, whatever happens, we can't tell a soul about this. Deal? Deal. Ever. Ever. Samar sighed. People would say we were crazy. And they'd probably be right, said Stephen. Samar jutted her chin at me. Tree, do you have anything to add? I didn't say a word. Samar and Stephen shared a smile. Figured it was worth a shot, she said. They headed off to school together. Stephen's father came out onto the porch. He was holding a cup of coffee. He caught sight of Stephen and Samar and frowned. A moment later, Samar's mother stepped out of the blue house, her keys jangling, a briefcase over her shoulder. She followed her neighbor's gaze. Both parents watched in silence until Stephen and Samar, walking side by side, disappeared from view.